like to introduce Ron Buffo. He's a lifelong resident of Louisville, Colorado. That's Louisville, not Louisville if you're from the Midwest. But he used to be a high school teacher there. He was the first editor of the Louisville Historian, and he was formerly on the Louisville Historical Commission, and he studied history for a very long time and spent most of his time looking at labor unrest in mining camps all across Colorado. A pretty popular topic in Colorado, but not widely known at all throughout U.S. history. And so, yeah, help me welcome him for his talk, Battle at the Hecla and the Ludlow Massacre, the Colorado Coalfield Wars of 1914.
My mom still really bothers me about, I'm really not a lifelong member because of a citizen of Louisville, because I moved about 8.5 years ago because my wife works in Cherry Creek Schools, and we had to move closer when I retired, and my mom thinks I live in Kansas or something now, but I still totally identify with Louisville. I lived there for years and years and years and really love the place. So thank you so much. It's really nice to see this many people coming out on a pretty hot afternoon here. I'm going to try to keep this to 45 minutes. I've abbreviated my presentation. Normally it's a little over an hour. So I hope it's really interesting for you, and I hope there are some really valuable things that you can take with this. And certainly understand that I have a real passion for this part of history, and it's mostly labor history, and really focuses on Louisville. And I am going to speak a little bit to Ludlow Massacre. And it's a really, we just had the 100th anniversary of Ludlow, the 100th anniversary of what happens in Louisville. So I'm going to concentrate more on Louisville because that's kind of the unknown one. It's not as big as the Ludlow Massacre, but it's a direct result of Ludlow. So I always start with this picture here. This is my grandfather, Dominic Buffo, or Buffo, doesn't matter. The Italian pronunciation is Buffo. My grandfather was born in 1900, and when he was 13 years old, he went to work in the mines around Louisville. No sense having that education in those mines, so he just will go down there and help out the family by working in these mines. Unfortunately, when he was 44 years old, he was working at the Columbine mine east of Lafayette, and there's the tipple for it. And he was working up on top of this tipple, and the idea was to make sure the conveyor belts were working fine. All the coal would come up on the tipple, and then it would dump out onto the railroad cars. They would grade this stuff out. And unfortunately for him, he was putting rosin on the conveyor belts, and he was wearing gloves, and one of his gloves got caught on the conveyor belt, and there were little protrusions sticking out there, and he lost his arm. Now, I'm not going to go into the gory details here, but his arm was not cut off. His arm was pulled off. And that's about as bad as I'm going to get in here. So he did live until he was 75 years old. What a strong man he was. I'll tell you what, he certainly is my hero. I lived next door to him. And I lived in the same town up until he died in 1975. Didn't have that arm. He was permanently disabled, of course. The United Mine Workers of America gave him $40 a month for the rest of his life, and the coal mine settled and gave him $5,000 for that one-time permanent disability. So he really couldn't work any longer after that. Lost his ability to speak. He had a blood clot go to a part of his brain where he couldn't speak. So it was mostly real simple kinds of things with his communication. But boy, what a strong old man he was, because working in those mines and then going through what he did. So I always started out this way because I'm from a family of miners. My great-grandfather came here in 1893 from Italy. He came with his brother Giacomo. They came right to Louisville for the express purpose of working in those mines. How much fun that must have been. Then his son, my grandfather, Dominic, worked in the mines. My great-uncle, my grandfather's brother, worked in the mines as well. And he's going to be a part of this whole Hecla thing here, too. And then thank goodness that my dad didn't have to work in the mines, and thank goodness I didn't have to work in the mines. That's the last thing I'd want to do. So the intent of this tonight is to kind of do this build-up to the labor union unrest that occurs in southern Colorado first. Actually, it's simultaneous is what's really happening here. But the big explosion starts at Ludlow, and then we'll move up, and we see a really interesting cover to a magazine here, which is certainly pretty propagandized. But that's okay. Shows a miner shooting and then holding a young child, which is sort of a reenactment of Ludlow is what that's supposed to be. I'm going to start briefly here in the northern fields because in actuality, the labor unrest in Colorado, in the Colorado coal fields, really started up here first, and it started against the Rocky Mountain Fuel Company. Rocky Mountain Fuel Company was more locally owned by a man named Roach, who was a big mine owner up here, owned most of the mines in the northern fields. And when I say northern fields, I mean Louisville, Lafayette, Superior, Dacono, Frederick, Erie, all in that big area there. Okay, so that's, the northern fields are pretty extensive for the most part. And what happens after a number of years, I mean, they're working these mines for a very, very long time here, but conditions don't change very much in these mines, and there are a lot of injuries. I just talked about my grandfather. That was 1944. We're going back here to 1910, 1914, and it was even worse before that. So it was pretty obvious that there needed to be changes made in the way miners were being treated. Now, back in those days, it was the United Mine Workers of America. There was another union called the IWW, the International Workers of the World, which sounds really socialist. And it was. Some people who hated the IWW said it stood for I won't work. So up here it was the UMWA, though, very, very powerful union organization. So what they did after a number of years is decided they need to start fighting for their rights. And these become the highlights of what they want to change in the mines for them. So just a little bit of a description. I'm going to go through this a little bit quicker as we go on, but just kind of the setup here. So obviously you want pay increases. I don't know if you know this, but in the coal mines, you only got paid for the amount of coal that you loaded on a daily basis. The old song, 16 tons, and what do you get? Another day older and deeper in debt. And I owe my soul to the company store. And I'll go into that just a little bit too, because that was different up here than it was in the South. So on average, if you could make about $3 a week, you were doing pretty good. And what was really important with that is if you had a son, younger sons, who could come in the mine and work for you, heck with school, because they could come and work alongside you, and so you could make more tonnage as the day went on, make a lot more money. Well, a lot more, make more money. Payment for narrow or dead work. You got paid in the mines only for loading coal, shoveling it into the coal car. You didn't get paid for putting timbers up so that the walls don't cave in and that kind of thing, getting water out of there, laying track, any of that stuff. That's all called narrow work. Obviously, safe working conditions. It was miserable down there. Coal dust, it was always a big problem. The Monarch Mine in 1936 blew up because of coal dust. And in these places, you had to keep watering this stuff down. Proper ventilation. Certainly, you had a major shaft that went down of the mine shaft, and usually there was another one also right next to it that was for ventilation purposes, but it was never quite good enough. 8-hour day. These guys were mostly working 8 hours a day, 6 days a week, sometimes 12 hours a day, especially during the winter. It was when you needed to really mine that coal. Check weighman. So when you loaded your coal in that car, you put a tag, there was a metal tag you had that was your number. You put that on the coal car after you'd loaded that car. It gets going down to the shaft. It's taken up the shaft to the tipple like I showed you in that first picture, and then they weighed your coal, okay? Unfortunately, if it was the company weighing your coal, they never weighed it quite right. So, you know, you're always going to get less tonnage. So they wanted somebody who was honest from their own ranks to weigh that for them. You know, and you also got deducted if there were a lot of rocks in your coal and that kind of stuff too. So, and then half holidays on Saturdays. So instead of a full day on Saturday, a half day. So just a few pictures to show you some of the conditions in there. The boys at the bottom on the left here are called breaker boys. Their job was to sit at these chutes and pick rocks out of coal. So, like I said, don't need an education, right? So we're going to send you, and we're going to. These guys, these kids didn't get paid hardly anything at all, but that's what they did all day long. You see these guys working in these kind of conditions because at the beginning it was pick and shovel work. That's all that it was. You went down. Now they did have explosives down in these mines. They had to bring these mine walls down and things like that, the coal walls and the coal seams. But you still had to do a lot of this picking like this. And then there's an example of a coal car right there. These coal cars were typically pulled by mules. Mules, back in the day, these mules were usually born in the mines, and they stayed their entire life. They never saw the light of day. They just stayed down there. They were stabled down there, and some of these mules had some really interesting characteristics. A few more pictures. This shows the coal car there, and that's usually when it went up to a tipple and you need to pour this thing out, you just tip sideways. It was what it did. And then there's a young boy there. These guys are just, when you see them after a day of work, they're just completely covered in coal is what they are. And then, of course, you've heard of black lung disease. Black lung disease is when you breathe that coal dust in, and basically it just solidifies your lungs is what it does. I mean, you have this serious form of emphysema, and a lot of these guys died from that. My grandfather had black lung disease, but that was the least of his worries. Okay, so now let's get to, before what happens up here in the north, take a look at Ludlow. Now, I'm not going to repeat all these because you can see that these are going to be, some of them are going to be the same. Down in the south, in the southern fields, Trinidad, Walsenburg, these were areas that were run by Eastern interests for the most part, the Rockefellers. They're the ones who, and that's, so they're widely hated in the south. Up here, Roach is not well liked up here, but his daughter later takes over his interest in the Rocky Mountain Fuel Company, and she actually is a pretty decent person. She actually changes some things for the miners up here, but that's after some things happen. Okay, so the Southern Fields were in September 1913. Same things, Mitchell Day, Czech Wayman. What's different in the Southern Fields is that down there, you had to live in company housing. Up here, it wasn't quite that case all the time. For instance, in Louisville, there was a company store, but the men did not live on the mine compounds like at the major mines. They actually lived in Louisville. My great-grandparents, my grandparents all lived in Louisville. Now, they might have had a rent from the company, so it's kind of the same thing. But you didn't get paid in actual money. I mean, you've heard of the thing called scrip. So you got paid in a piece of paper is what you got paid that said how much you had made for a particular week. Then you got to take that piece of paper and you got to go to the company store to buy what you needed. So you never made money, you made paper. And they charged you what they wanted to charge you. You had to pay for your own tools. You know, you had to pay for the shovels and the picks and things like, you know, all of your clothes, all that kind of thing. So, and the food, so you bought the food from them. So they wanted you beholden to them. They had complete power over you is what they did. And the Southern Fields, that's certainly true. Now, what's different in the Southern Fields is that you go to a place like Ludlow. Ludlow is not in or near a town. It's close to Trinidad for the most part, but it's out by itself, so it was more remote. So they had to build a company town out there. When they built that company town out there, that's where you stayed and that's where you worked. And, you know, if you had a Sunday off, you could go into Trinidad, but everything was controlled right out there. So that becomes a big problem for the Southern Fields. Up here, when there's a strike, the strike takes out about 3,500 miners up in the northern fields. In the southern fields, we're looking at 10 to 12,000 miners. When they go on strike, they're kicked out of those camps, and they have to set up their own tent colonies outside of these camps. They can't go into town. They can't go to Trinidad to rent a house. They have to go outside these camps is what they have to do. And that'll be the problem at Ludlow. So the miners up here actually go out on strike first. In fact, the miners out here go on strike in 1910 to 1914. Can you imagine that? A 4-year strike. It's called the long strike. Long strike, it's a good term for it. In the South, they go out in about 1913. So they're out only for a few years, but it's certainly considerably more than in the North as far as numbers go. So here's the deal. When those miners went out on strike, what do the mine companies have to do? Bring in workers, right? So you bring in whoever you can, and you get them into work. Of course, the term used for that is scab. And so there was huge animosity between the striking miners and the miners who came in to take their place. Well, what they had to do was they had to bring those strike breakers into those mines, put them up in those houses, and then put wire around these, big fences and wiring around these compounds to protect these miners, because those striking miners wanted to kill them is what they wanted to do. They're destroying what they're trying to fight for. So what Rockefeller had to do, what Roach did up here as well, is that they called in detective agencies. You've heard of the Pinkertons? one of the oldest ones around. They were in the Colorado fields. The one we're most familiar with in both the North and the South is going to be the Baldwin Felts Detective Agency. Basically, a bunch of thugs who were brought out from the east. They'd already busted heads out in Pennsylvania and West Virginia. There's a movie out called Matewan. If you ever have a chance, watch that. It's all about the same sort of thing back east. And so these guys come out. They have their little badges. How official that is. But they are well armed. They come out with high-powered rifles. They come out with machine guns. They set up gun emplacements in all of these mines that are on strike. They have searchlights in all of these mines, and they're looking for strikers to come in and cause problems, and they have no problem shooting at these guys. And they also do a really good job of harassing these miners who are out on strike too. So they are very disliked in all of the fields. There's no love for any of them at all. Down in the South, take this. There's the Death Special. It was an armored car. Literally, it was an armored car. But anyway, you can see it. It's this big old jalopy here that has steel wrapped around the thing, and so they were driving that around in the southern fields, mostly around Ludlow and places like that. They go around carrying their guns or on horseback, that sort of thing. So we see them in almost all of these mining camps. Well, the problem is it gets so bad in both of these areas, the north and the south, is that the governor, because there's shooting that's going on, there are some killings that actually take place in the southern fields. There are people being assaulted on both sides. And so the Governor Ammons, decides that he needs to call in for more help. So he calls the Colorado militia. Now, I'm from Louisville, and I can't believe it. From the time I could remember, my grandparents always talked about the damn militia. They hated them. They absolutely hated them for what they had done, certainly at Ludlow, and then for what could possibly happen up here, too. And they do come up here. So you have these guys. A lot of these guys were veterans of the Philippine insurrection. They had seen some combat, that sort of thing. They had certainly seen a lot of violence, and they were happy to serve in that position that they were in. I don't want to demean everybody who was in the Colorado militia, because I'm sure there were some good guys too, but certainly following orders. And the orders were to bust heads. You don't put up with these striking miners, and you put them in their place, and by golly, that's the way we're going to get this thing done. So the mine operators certainly understood that. Back in those days, the mine operators knew that if they had problems, they could go to the governor, and if the governor had problems, he could go right to the president. And the president of the United States was happy to call in the military. Sometimes it was better if the military was called in, but they actually did a lot of things. The military came in and did a lot of things to put down these labor disputes. So General Chase is the guy up there on the left of that one picture. And you have these other guys who are part of the militia as well. Dressed in uniforms, absolutely. They were military. So it gets so bad in the southern fields and at Ludlow. Of course, the tent colony, and this shows, it's a little bit hard to see, but there's the tent colony on the left. You see, what they had to do is put their own tents up. They dug underneath those tents, so they had a little bit of a cellar there because they were afraid of bullets coming through these tents and shooting them. And then that's where they put their stoves and things like that. But ultimately what happens is that shots are fired, the tent colony is started on fire, there's still a bit of uncertainty about how that fire starts. The fact of the matter is 13 people die. And it is seen certainly as a massacre, and it was the militia, it was the detective agency, it was Rockefeller. So there were huge problems that erupt in the southern fields, and they're certainly going to happen up here as well. So, upon that happening, this is a call to arms. Organize the men in your community and companies of volunteers to protect workers of Colorado against the murder and cremation of men, women, and children by armed assassins in the employ of the coal corporations, serving under the guise of state militiamen. So this obviously was put out by the union. And I will tell you what happened is that there was a massive arming of striking miners in the northern and southern fields. I'll show you some of those guys with their guns and things like that. But my great uncle participated in the conflict that was up here, and they had 30 rifles, repeating rifles that were sent up here by the union. It's still hard to find real verification of that, but they came out here in train loads, in boxes and just opened those boxes for these striking miners, and they pulled those guns out of there, and they got their ammunition, and they were going to go to war, and it's exactly what they did. I still have my great-uncle's gun from that strike in 1910 to 1914. He actually sold it to somebody in Louisville. My dad found out about it, went back to the guy and bought it back from him, so we still have the gun. And these are very, very powerful rifles. And that shows you an example of those there. These guys are in the southern fields. So these are striking miners. They're well armed. See the bandoliers on this guy. This other guy looks pretty fancy here. But you know, they're willing to fight. They're willing to take up arms and do what they had to do because they felt like they had to protect themselves now. They felt like they were being put upon, certainly, and people dying because of what they wanted to fight for, so it was a problem. And I know it's hot in here, folks. I'm sweating a little bit too, but hang in there with me. Won't go too long. This is a map of Louisville, and it probably doesn't mean anything looking at it like that right there. But if you've been to Louisville, and you know where the King Soopers is at in Louisville on South Boulder Road, that's the exact place that I'm going to be talking about. So we have all this conflict in the south, and now all of a sudden the miners up here say, oh my gosh, it's going to happen to us up here too. What can we do about this? So it's going to center around a number of mines, but one of the big mines is going to be called the Hecla Mine, a mine that is in Louisville and was very, very productive for a lot of years. That star up there is the intersection of South Boulder Road and Highway 42 is where that's at. So like I said, it's King Soopers. There's a Burger King there. You'd never know there was a mine there. This shows a little bit of a blow-up of the area, and it shows where the Hecla Mine is up there. And it says South Boulder Road. There's a red square around that. That was the Hecla compound. I'm going to show you some pictures. It was all fenced in. Striking miners were out, of course. Strike breakers were in. You can also see from here, years ago they did a survey on subsistence of coal mines in the area. These mines, if you look at them, they go as deep as 200 feet with the Hecla, 200 with the Rex mine, 200 feet down here. In the Louisville, Lafayette area alone, Superior, there were about 21 working mines in 1910 to 1914. So there was a bunch of them going. But again, that just kind of shows you an aerial view of what it looked like. This had to be back in the 1970s, I think, because there was a farm there, and there was another house on the corner. There wasn't all that development that's there now. And this is what you saw on that mine compound. This was a drawing that they had at the time. And it shows in the middle there is what's called the casino. It's actually the mine headquarters, and in front, kind of to the right there. There was also a wash house that was used for miners when they came up out of the mines, could wash at night. There also was a kind of an apartment complex, a boarding sort of a room for people, for miners who were single miners and didn't have a place to live. And then you had all these other places for the miners who were actually working out there with their families, who were strike breakers, okay? They all stayed right out there. And here's the weird thing. So these strike breakers had families, and their kids had to go to school. And they had to be walked into Louisville every day to go to school. And guess what? They got beat up all the time. Eventually, the detective agency had to escort these kids to school under armed guard so they wouldn't get beat up. There was a doctor in Louisville, a guy named Dr. Wolfer. And Dr. Wolfer was the mine doctor out there. He went out there one time to take care of somebody. He got beat up on his way out there. So he said, I'm not doing that anymore. So there's a lot of really internal strife that's going on within the people in Louisville. So none of this is there anymore. The only thing that's in Louisville that's out there now is the casino, and I'll show you a picture of that. Or it's really interesting. Mine headquarters, there's actually a brothel on the second floor. And that shows it. So it doesn't show the brothel, but so here are the little houses on the left, this top left-hand picture. There's the mine headquarters with the water tower. Off to the left of that would have been a tower with a machine gun on it and a searchlight. Off to the right is the kind of a boarding room or the boarding house. and then the washroom later on. So back in 1989, I did a 25th anniversary of what happened up here, and we did a walking tour, and I took pictures of the place then. So this on the top right is the mine headquarters. It was a farmhouse after it was the mine, and the guy who owned that farmed all that land out there, and that was his farmhouse. They later moved that. That house is still back behind the property, but it's about the only thing left of the whole thing. And there it is right there. They actually moved this farther north is what they did. And I've understood that there's a nursing home that's back there. Can't remember, it's Balfour, I think. Anyway, I think they own the rights to that house, and Louisville's fighting right now to try to keep that preserved and not have them tear it down. Okay, so quickly, things start happening up here in the northern fields. Same thing that was happening in the southern fields. A lot of conflict going on between the striking miners and the mine operators, and especially detective agents. And gunfire being exchanged between the town and the mine compound itself. So lots of problems that way. So Sheriff Buster, who was the Boulder County Sheriff at the time, had to come in and had to try to keep peace in Boulder County. He was obviously headquartered in Boulder, but he had a car, by the way, then. He would drive to Superior, he'd drive to Louisville, he'd drive to Lafayette. He'd make his rounds trying to keep these miners in control, which he never really could. But I will say that Sheriff Buster probably did more than anybody to try to keep the conflict down as good as he could. I'm not sure anybody could have done a better job. He didn't take sides. He was really proud of that. And if you look here, he's also the first sheriff who introduces motorcycles to Boulder County. Okay, so we're going to get into Louisville. And again, if you're not familiar with Louisville, these probably don't make a whole lot of sense. But this is on Main Street, and this is the Union Hall in Louisville in 1909. And today, that's where the Blue Parrot restaurant is at. So this section that we're looking straight at here, that's approximately where the Union Hall was at. What happens in Louisville happens approximately a week after Ludlow, with all the tensions that are going around. The Union Hall obviously is a center for a lot of that tension, and what Sheriff Buster is going to find on the night of, it's going to be Sunday, I think April 21st, is that he goes to Louisville, actually goes to Superior first. He finds a bunch of miners over there who are just really angry and armed, and he figures, okay, I better go to Louisville, see what's going on there. He goes there. There's a huge union meeting. There are like 400 miners in the hall and outside of it, heavily armed, and they're in there making crazy speeches, and he walks in, and he's trying to get this thing calmed down, but he can't. These guys are ready to go to war because of what was implied from Ludlow and because of the things that have been going on up here. So somebody runs out of the Union Hall, goes down to the fire hall, starts ringing a bell, which is the alarm bell, and then everybody goes crazy, and now everybody is going to march out on the Hecla Mine is what they really want to do. Sheriff Buster decides that he needs to go to the Hecla Mine, so he actually walks there. So he goes down. It's actually east to the railroad tracks, and this is showing where he goes to the train depot, and then he walks up the track. Him and a couple of deputies is what they do. So they're walking up these railroad tracks, and they're trying to get to the Hecla Mine. I'm not sure what the intent was, because things were going to happen here that aren't going to be very good. He goes past what is called the Old Louisville Inn. I don't know if you've ever been there on Front Street. That is the original. It's on the left-hand side just as you go on Front Street here. And a really interesting story with this one. Miners like to drink a lot, and sometimes they'd get a little too much in them. There was an old Italian guy who loved to drink down here, and he was in the Italian army, and he was a sharpshooter for the Italian army. That's the story, which always makes me laugh. So he would go out of this bar. There was a siding there that had railroad cars on it. He would climb up on top of a railroad car, and he had a high-powered rifle, and he would shoot the spotlight out from the Hecla Mine. And let me tell you, that's quite a distance. But he could do that, so he loved doing that. I'm not sure what else he did. I've got to find out his name. It's like years ago when you're little, you talk to people, and they say their name, it's like, and then you forget. So, but anyway, that is still there today. Interesting landmark. As Sheriff Buster gets up to where the Hecla Mine is at, if you remember on the map, there was a Hecla Mine, and then across the street there was a mine called the Rex Number 1. So there were guys over there too. So this doesn't have a whole lot to do with the story, and only in that he'll hole up here for just a little bit before he gets to the Hecla. He doesn't even get to the Hecla. Just one I inserted here. There was a dynamite house at the Hecla Mine. This old structure. I'm not sure this would hold much of an explosion, but it had steel doors on and that. When they developed that whole area, they tore this down, and there was a restaurant back there called Karen's in the Country, and they actually took the bricks from this and made the floor an entryway to that restaurant. It's a law firm now, I think, but I'm sure that floor is still there. So that's really one of the only things that's kind of left there. Okay, so to cut to the chase, what happens is that Sheriff Buster gets caught between the Hecla Mine and the town. And in the town, all these miners are coming up with their 30-30 rifles, 30-30 is what they call them. They come up to the railroad tracks, and they start pouring gunfire into the Hecla Mine. The detective agents up there with their machine guns and all that, they start shooting back at these guys. So there is this huge gun battle that takes place on this one night, 21st. So that's Sunday night into Monday. And estimates are, I don't know how you estimate this, but 18,000 rounds of ammunition fired between the town and the Hecla Mine itself. And the next day, Sheriff Buster actually got caught in between at a house, him and his deputies, and they just had to hunker down there. They couldn't leave this place all night long. And finally, when the shooting subsided in the morning, he got up and he went up to the Hecla, and this is what he found. And it's hard to see here. This is a company house on the left, and this is the boarding house, but it is peppered with holes. There are bullet holes all over these things. Nobody was in these because they knew exactly what was happening. So, and that shows you also the tower that had the machine gun in it. Just a few other things, and kind of get to the end here. So here was all this gunfire. In all of that gunfire, one man was killed. Said he had his jaw shot off. That's what they said. Jaw shot off. Oh, this is another interesting too. If you know anything about Louisville, Louisville has always had a running problem with Boulder. They never liked us, and I'm from Louisville. I never liked Boulder either. So they're okay now. They're fine. I've matured a lot. But no kidding. I don't know if you know this. At one time, Boulder was dry. And so they always had to go to Louisville to get their alcohol. So they called us Liquorville is what they called us. But this is what's really interesting, is in Boulder, when this whole thing was going on, there was a call to arms in Boulder. The good citizens of Boulder were going to arm themselves and come over here and help Sheriff Buster put down this insurrection, by golly. And they never did. But they were talking. But they never did. I don't know. I'm not sure they might have had the stomach for it or not, but it ended very quickly. I think that's part of the reason, certainly. I'll tell you another little background story, too, is that leading up to this big night when all this shooting was going on, people in Louisville were subjected to gunfire coming into town. Of course, they were firing back, too, so... the people on the east side of Louisville who live there, it's called Little Italy. A lot of the Italians live there, not all of them. But they actually had to move their children to the other side of town or ship their kids off to other communities like Denver or whatever to avoid the gunfire. Or if you lived in those houses nearby, you had to sleep in your cellar at night because of random bullets coming through your house and that kind of stuff. The train that would come through Louisville would bisect this whole thing. And what they had to do was when they came, this is called the interurban, and when that train came through, they told people they had to lay on the floor because they're not sure if they'd get shot going through Louisville. So I don't think anybody ever did, but it was so one of those crazy things. My great-grandfather, who was pretty much retired, he actually had a serious case of black lung disease, emphysema, and he would die in the early 1920s. But on the night that this was happening, he lived just a block up from Main Street in Louisville, a block west, up by the museum actually. And they had outhouses back then, obviously. I don't know what compelled him when all this gunfire was going on to think that he had to go to the bathroom. But he went out there when all this gunfire was going on. He was sitting out there, and sure enough, a bullet came through the outhouse and creased the top of his hand. It wasn't terrible or anything like that. It was a great story. Scared the poop out of him, yeah. So it always, that's a true story. I'm not I'm not lying about that. That's a true story. So yeah, it's like one of the legends in our family and that sort of thing. So anyway, you hear of those kinds of things that are happening, throughout this whole, even 4 years. But that culmination on that particular night, I think, is pretty extraordinary stuff. If you go to Louisville today, it's hard to go in on what's called Murphy's Hill. It's next to Highway 42, and you go west into Louisville there. It's all blocked off because the floods last September washed out the bridge that was down there. But what happened is that because of all this gunfire, right away, Governor Ammons calls in the militia. Detectives up there, agencies not being able to do very much. So these guys who had been down at Ludlow now are making their way up to Louisville. They come by train, they get shot at coming up here. They actually get off of the train south of Louisville, and they march into town. And this actually shows them marching into Louisville on what is called Front Street. And if you were to go there today, that's exactly what it looks like. I can't remember, but I think the speed limit sign there says something like 15. I can't remember. But those houses are there today. So I did the best I could to try to get kind of like before and after pictures, that sort of thing, to sort of preserve that. So the story of the militia is a short one. They come up here, and it even causes more and more tensions up here. People hate the militia, and they knew what they did at Ludlow, and right away Ammons figured this out and said, we got to get these guys out of here. And so he does. So the militia is only there for like 2 days, and they get them out of there very, very quickly. And what the president is able to do then, this would be Wilson at the time, he calls in Army troops from Fort Robinson in Nebraska. And they come down here by train, and they decamp here by the railroad. In Louisville, off of Highway 42, there's a baseball field on the west side of Highway 42. It's called Miners Field, appropriately. Across that is a big open field, and that's where these guys camped out at. They stayed there for a year in Louisville, and by that time things had simmered down. Wasn't a lot of animosities. By the way, always amazes me with this, the miners went back to work and were given no concessions for the most part. They needed to work. They'd been out for 4 years. It's like, this is ridiculous. But what did happen is that it does set the tone, and in a very short period of time, they do start to get more and more of the concessions, and however good it can get, it got better, certainly. So federal troops, some of the federal troops actually dated some of the women in Louisville, married some of them, that sort of thing. So I guess that's kind of a nice-hearted story that comes with the end of this. But I think more than anything what the lesson is from this is that, there are two sides to a story. And I always, I think my story is pretty one-sided. I certainly agree with that, and I don't make any bones about that. But I also know that how crazy it must have been to work in these mines and to work under those kinds of conditions. And men were being killed, on a weekly basis sometimes. I had a figure one time, I can't remember what it was, but on the average, how many were actually dying in Colorado. Coal miners are dying today. Every now and then you see something about a coal mine accident, especially back in West Virginia. We don't mine much here anymore. And it's all mechanized, but it's certainly really dangerous work. And for them to have to put up with that, and then on top of that, just kind of be put upon with the kind of money that they made and how they were cheated out of wages. The bad thing for them was that back in 1914, if you were in a union, you were considered a communist. And there was a huge Red Scare in this country back then. And it was really difficult to organize. If you were an organizer at a mine, they ran you out if they didn't kill you. And there's some big stories about these guys who were the organizers and the kinds of things that happened to them. That's my presentation. 45 minutes. I did all right.